My mom can cook and sew. 7-year-old June whispered the words into the rancher's ear. His mother's future seemed to depend on those simple words. His voice trembled with a weight no child should ever carry. She can make a home out of nothing. She can fix broken things. Silas Thorne slowly looked past the boy. He saw the Chinese widow sitting alone at the Laramie train station. It was the autumn of 1885. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and coming snow. Steam drifted from the locomotive, hanging like a ghost over the iron rails. Liling sat on a weathered wooden bench beside her battered wooden trunk. Her head was bowed beneath the weight of exhaustion and grief. Her deep crimson robe was faded and stained by the red railroad dust of 1,000 miles. Months earlier, her husband had been killed in a rock slide while working on a railroad project in the Sierra Nevada. The railroad had moved on, leaving her behind in a land that saw her as an intruder. Now she and June had reached Wyoming with almost nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Hostility toward Chinese immigrants was a rising tide in the territories. The Chinese Exclusion Act had deepened fear and hostility toward Chinese immigrants. Liling had learned to keep her eyes on the ground. She had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. June, however, had noticed Silas across the platform. The rancher was 45, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of hard work. His hands were calloused and his eyes were tired. 4 years earlier, fever had stolen his wife Sarah in the middle of a sweltering July. Since then, the Thorne Ranch had become painfully quiet. The house was dusty and the hearth was empty. June had seen the worn coat on Silas's back. He had seen the jagged tear near the left pocket. To an observant boy, that tear looked like an invitation.
It looked like a job that needed doing. So Jun had crossed the platform, dodging the heavy boots of travelers. He reached up and tugged gently at the rough wool of Silas's sleeve. Silas turned, expecting the boy to ask for money or food. Instead, he saw a frightened child trying very hard not to look afraid. Silas crouched until they were eye to eye. His spurs jingled softly on the station boards. That was when June whispered the only argument he had. "My mom can cook and sew." He pointed toward Liling, who was unaware her son had left her side. "She is the best." Then his courage faltered, his lower lip quivering in the frost. "Please, sir, the station master says we have to leave before dark." Silas looked toward Miller, the station master, standing near the ticket office. Miller was a man who enjoyed the small power his uniform gave him. He was already striding toward Liling with an impatient expression. He carried a heavy broom in one hand and tapped it impatiently against the platform. Something old and forgotten stirred inside Silas's chest. It was a spark of decency he thought had died with his wife. He had come to Laramie for grain and salt. He had not come looking for a widow or a child. But Silas knew what loneliness looked like. He knew the suffocating weight of being unwanted. "Is that so?" Silas asked. His voice was low and steady. Jun nodded frantically, hope lighting up his dark eyes. Silas stood up, his height casting a long shadow over the boy. He didn't care about the whispers beginning to ripple through the station. He walked toward Liling.
The station master reached her first. "Time to move on, lady," Miller snapped, tapping his broom against the bench. "This ain't a hotel for your kind." Liling looked up, her face pale and etched with fear. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the broom. Silas stepped into the space between them. He was a wall of leather and wool. "This ain't your business, Thorne," Miller snapped, his face reddening. "These people are a nuisance." "It is now," Silas replied. His voice was flat, carrying the weight of a man who didn't make idle threats. "They're with me." Miller opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Silas's eyes silenced him. Silas Thorne was not a man people crossed lightly in Laramie. Silas turned to Liling. He didn't know her language, and she didn't know his, but the language of the frontier was often spoken in actions. He pointed to the heavy wooden trunk beside her. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. Liling looked at June, who had run back to her side. The boy grabbed her hand and nodded with a desperate smile. He pointed to the big man in the wagon waiting in the street. Silas lifted the trunk carefully, handling it with the respect due to a person's entire life. June understood before his mother did. He pulled on Liling's hand, leading her toward the wagon.
She rose slowly, her silk robe rustling against the rough boards. The townspeople watched in stunned silence. Silas knew exactly what they were thinking. He didn't give them a second look.
He helped Liling up onto the high seat of the wagon. Her hand was small and cold in his. He hoisted June up beside her, then climbed into the driver's seat. He snapped the reins, and the horses leaned into their collars. The ride to the Thorn Ranch took several hours. The town disappeared behind them as the wagon wheels hummed against the dry earth. The vastness of Wyoming began to swallow them whole. Liling held June close, her eyes wide as she stared at the horizon. The world here seemed impossibly large compared to the village she remembered in Guangdong. In China, the mountains were green and the air was thick. Here, the earth was brown and the sky was an endless, piercing blue. The wind blew constantly, a restless spirit that never seemed to sleep. June eventually fell asleep against her shoulder. He was exhausted by the day's terror and the rhythm of the wagon. Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead. He was acutely aware of the woman sitting beside him. She smelled of jasmine and old wood smoke. He knew the rumors in Laramie would spread like a grass fire, but for the first time in years, the silence beside him did not feel empty. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was dipping below the peaks. The house looked gray and tired in the dying light. The porch sagged, and the windows were clouded with dust. Silas opened the heavy front door. It groaned on its hinges, a sound of long-standing loneliness. "It ain't much," he muttered. He carried the trunk inside and set it in the corner. Liling walked in slowly, taking in every detail of the wreckage of his life. She saw the cold, ash-filled stove. She saw the mountain of unwashed tin plates on the counter. She saw the holes in the curtains where moths had made their home.
She didn't say a word. She didn't complain about the lack of comfort. Instead, she walked straight to the stove. She touched the cold iron with her fingertips, then looked at Silas. She made a small, quick motion of striking a match. Silas nodded and hurried outside to the woodshed. He brought in an armload of dry pine and cedar. Within minutes, a fire was roaring, its orange light dancing off the grimy walls. Liling opened her trunk with practiced movements. She pulled out a small iron wok and a silk bag of rice. She moved with a grace Silas had never seen before. Her hands were quick and precise. She found the salted pork Silas had left on the table. She sliced it thin, almost translucent, using a small, sharp knife. She found a few dried onions in Silas's pantry and sliced them into the pot. Soon the room filled with the warm smell of rice, onions, and pork. It was a scent that had been missing from this house for 4 long years. Silas sat at the heavy wooden table, his mouth watering. He had been living on hardtack and bitter coffee for months. The meal was simple, but it was the best thing Silas had tasted in months. The pork was tender, and the rice was perfect. "Come to the table," Silas said. He gestured toward the empty chairs. Liling hesitated, looking at the floor. Then, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she sat across from him with June. They ate in a silence that was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a peaceful silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. That night, Silas did what he knew was right. He gave them his bed, the only one with warm quilts. He gathered a bundle of blankets and went out to the barn.
The smell of hay and horses was familiar and comforting. He lay in the loft, looking at the stars through the gaps in the roof. They were bright and cold, like diamonds on black velvet. He knew his neighbors would whisper at the store. But as he drifted off to sleep, he heard a faint sound from the house. It was the sound of a broom hitting the floorboards. Liling was already reclaiming the house from the dust. Long after June had fallen asleep, Liling sat beside the small window. She pulled her husband's old wool scarf from her trunk and pressed it to her chest. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to cry. The tears were silent and hot against her cold skin. She missed the man she had crossed an ocean with. She missed the sound of her name spoken in a voice that felt like home. She was terrified of this vast, empty land. Then June stirred beneath the blankets, murmuring in his sleep. Liling wiped her eyes before June woke. Tomorrow would require her strength again. The next morning, Silas woke to a house he barely recognized. The windows were crystal clear, scrubbed of years of grime. The sun streamed in like molten gold, illuminating a floor that actually shone. Liling was at the table, her sleeves rolled up, kneading dough. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, tight bun.
June was outside, carrying a small bucket from the well. The boy saw Silas and gave him a wide, bright grin. "I told you," June shouted. Silas walked to the table and saw a pile of his old shirts. Every single one had been mended with nearly invisible stitches. The jagged tears were gone, replaced by sturdy repairs. He picked up his favorite flannel shirt. It had been ripped by a barbed wire fence months ago.
Now, the repair was so fine it looked like a decorative pattern. This woman was a creator. She was taking the wreckage of his life and stitching it back together. That afternoon, Silas noticed the soles of June's boots were nearly worn through. The leather was as thin as paper. The boy was walking carefully to avoid the sharp stones. Silas said nothing at the time, but after supper he took the small boots to the barn. He worked by the light of a lantern, using his best leather scraps. He reinforced the soles and mended the laces. The next morning, June found his boots sitting beside the door. They had new, sturdy leather patches and shone with fresh oil. "Mama," the boy whispered, holding them up in disbelief. Liling looked toward Silas, her eyes softening with a new kind of understanding. Silas pretended to be very interested in the bottom of his coffee cup. He cleared his throat and looked out the window. But Liling understood. He wasn't just a man providing a roof. He was a man who looked after his own. One detail I wanted to capture in this story is how small acts of work could mean far more than words on the frontier. A repaired shirt, a warm meal, or a child's mended boots could become a way of saying, "You belong here." Stay with me, because Liling and Silas are about to discover how costly that sense of home can become. As the weeks passed, the world outside the ranch grew darker. Silas went into town for winter supplies, leaving Liling and June at the ranch. When he walked into the general store, the usual chatter died down. Jeb, the owner, wouldn't look him in the eye. "People are talking, Silas," Jeb said quietly. "Miller's been telling anyone who will listen that you shouldn't have taken them in." Silas's jaw tightened until it felt like stone. "They're under my roof, Jeb." "I'm just telling you, some men are angry enough to make trouble," Jeb warned. "Don't let 'em find that someone at your place." Silas left the store without another word. On his way to the wagon, he saw Miller standing with a group of rough men. Miller didn't speak, but his smirk was a warning. Silas drove the wagon home faster than usual. The wind was picking up, carrying the first real bite of winter. When he arrived, he found Liling on the porch in the orange sunset. She was working on something large and colorful. It was a quilt, unlike any Silas had ever seen. She had taken scraps of his old work clothes, denim and flannel. She had combined them with pieces of her own crimson and gold silk. It was two different worlds stitched together in a single piece of fabric. It was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever seen. He sat down on the step beside her. "Liling," he said softly. She looked at him, her needle poised in midair. He wanted to tell her they were in danger. He wanted to tell her he would protect her with his life. Instead, he reached out and touched a patch of red silk on the quilt. "It's beautiful," he said. She understood the tone. She reached over and placed her hand on top of his. Her skin was soft, but her palm was calloused from labor. It was the first time they had truly touched. For the first time in years, Silas felt something close to home. The trouble Jeb warned about came on a Tuesday evening. The sky was a bruised purple. The rhythmic thud of hooves grew louder across the dry grass. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Winchester and stepped onto the porch. 6 riders stopped beyond the front fence. Miller was among them, his face twisted with bitter anger. One man carried a flickering lantern, its light moving across the yard. Silas stood his ground, his rifle held low but ready. "You've come far enough," he said. Miller stayed on his horse, looking down with contempt. "People in town want the woman and the boy gone, Thorne. They don't belong here." "People in town don't decide who lives in my house," Silas replied. "This is my land." "You're making enemies of your own kind, Silas," Miller sneered. "Is it worth it?" "Then make me the enemy," Silas said, stepping forward. "Leave them out of it and ride back to town." Just then the door creaked open. Liling and June appeared in the doorway. June was clutching his mother's skirt, his eyes wide with terror. But Liling stood tall, her face a mask of frozen dignity. She was holding the quilt she had been working on for weeks. She walked past Silas and stepped onto the edge of the porch. The silk and denim shimmered in the lantern light.
Liling began to speak in her native Cantonese. Her voice was low, melodic, and steady. She wasn't begging. She was telling a story. June stepped up beside her, translating with a shaking voice. "She says her husband worked on the railroad," June whispered. "She says he died working on the railroad, so trains could cross the west. She says he died before they could make another home together."
Liling touched a square of faded denim on the quilt. "That is Mr. Thorne's shirt," June explained. Then she touched a piece of vibrant red silk. That was hers. June looked at the man on their horses. "She says this quilt is what happens when broken things are given another chance." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the fence posts. One of the younger riders lowered his eyes, looking ashamed. Another shifted uneasily in his saddle. They had come expecting fear and a fight. Instead, they were looking at a widow, a child, and a rancher who refused to abandon them. Miller's anger remained, but he could feel the momentum leaving his group. "This isn't worth it," one of the riders muttered. He turned his horse and began to trot away into the darkness. Then another followed, and another. Miller realized he no longer had a crowd to hide behind. "This ain't over, Thorne," Miller snapped, though it sounded hollow. "Maybe not," Silas said, "but it's over tonight." Miller turned his horse and followed the others. The sound of their departure faded into the vast silence. When the last rider disappeared, Liling's strength gave way. The quilt slipped from her fingers. She lowered her head and began to cry. Silas crossed the yard and stopped in front of her. He simply wrapped his big, rough arms around her. Liling leaned against him, her forehead resting against his chest. "You're safe here," he whispered into the wind.
She understood that for the first time since losing her husband, she was not alone. Over the following year, the bond between the three of them grew stronger. By late 1886, Liling's English had improved significantly. June grew taller and stronger, learning how to handle the cattle. The ranch slowly became a home for all three of them. Then came the brutal winter of 1886-87. History would remember it as the terrible season of the Great Die-Up. Then the first great blizzard came with a fury that seemed to swallow the horizon. Temperatures plunged far below zero. The air itself felt like a wall of ice. The cattle began to huddle in the draws, freezing where they stood. Silas was out in the storm every day, fighting to save the herd. One evening, Silas's horse returned to the ranch without him. The animal was shivering, its coat encrusted with ice. The empty saddle told Liling everything she needed to know. She didn't panic. She wrapped herself in her heaviest wool cloak and lit a lantern. She took a coil of rope and stepped into the white void. June tried to follow her. "No," she told him firmly. "Stay by the stove and keep the fire high." Liling took the ranch's old draft horse. It was a sturdy beast that could walk through deep drifts. She followed the line of the fence, the only landmark left. Half a mile from the house, she found him. Silas was lying beside a snowdrift, his face pale and his breathing shallow. His horse had stumbled, throwing him hard onto the frozen ground. Silas was conscious, but his leg was badly injured. "Liling," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. She knelt beside him in the freezing snow.
"Home," she said. It was the most important word they shared. She helped him onto the low feed sled she had tied behind the horse. The journey back was an agonizing crawl. The wind tried to knock them over. At last, the yellow light from the ranch windows appeared. June held the door open while Liling guided the sled as close to the porch as she could. Together, they helped Silas inside. Liling wrapped him in dry blankets and stayed beside him through the night. When the weather finally eased, she sent word to town for a doctor. The doctor arrived on a sleigh, his face grim. He examined Silas and shook his head in wonder. "You found him just in time," the doctor said. "Another night in that storm might have killed him." For days, Liling barely left Silas's side. She brought him hot broth and kept the fire burning. She slept in the chair beside his bed, her hand always near his.
When Silas finally opened his eyes and stayed awake, the room was quiet. He saw Liling asleep in the chair. June was curled up on a rug at her feet. Silas looked at the two people he had once brought home out of pity. He realized how wrong he had been. He hadn't saved them. They had saved him. They were not guests in his house. They were his family. When spring arrived, the hills of Laramie turned a vibrant green. One afternoon, Silas called Liling and June out to the porch. He was leaning on a sturdy cane, but he was walking. "I spoke to a lawyer in town today," Silas said.
He handed Liling a folded document. Silas explained its meaning slowly, using the simple English Liling had learned over the past year. "I had a lawyer draw up papers to make sure you and June are protected if anything happens to me." Liling looked at Silas. He had given her something she had not possessed in a long time: security. But Silas wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band. "I don't have much left after the winter, Liling," he said. "But I have a home, and I want you to be the heart of it. Forever." Liling looked at the ring, then at the man who had stood between her and the world. She looked across the land she had fought so hard to call home. At last, she smiled. She stepped closer and kissed Silas softly on the porch. June quickly covered his mouth to hide a wide grin. The years that followed were not always easy. The frontier was never a kind place for long. But the Thorn Ranch endured. Liling's quilts became treasured by families throughout the valley. They were stories told in silk and denim. June grew into a capable young man with a gift for caring for horses. And Silas never returned to the silence that had once filled his house. Many years later, Silas and Liling sat together on the porch at sunset. Across their laps rested the old quilt. Its colors faded, but its stitches strong. "Funny thing," Silas said, squeezing her hand. "I thought I was bringing you home that day." Liling rested her head against his shoulder. "No," she answered in the English she now spoke with ease.
"We brought each other home." If Liling and June's journey touched your heart, tell me which moment stayed with you most. Was it June's whisper at the station, or the night Liling brought Silas home through the storm? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories of love and courage on the American frontier. Until next time, take care of one another. This is a fictional historical romance inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters, dialogue, and some events have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Historical discrimination and moments of peril are included as part of the fictional historical setting. AI-assisted tools may have been used during the creative production process.